They told you sin is evil, that if you disobey God, you burn. But what if I told you sin was never about good or bad? What if it was just a way to see who follows orders and who dares to think? In this video, we're not just questioning religion, we're questioning obedience itself. And by the end, you'll know whether you're truly moral or just trained. Let's begin. Sure thing. What even is sin? Where did it come from? And what if, just what if, the entire concept was never about stopping evil, but about taming power?
Okay, sin. Sin is essentially going against the teachings of God. Sin is things which God explicitly has told us not to do. And sin across cultures, it doesn't matter if it is Western Abrahamic culture or if it is Eastern Dharmic cultures. Either way, sin is something that you're not supposed to do because God asks you not to do that. And since God is supposed to represent all good, all powerful and highest authority, going against it is considered bad, and that is the moral founding of sin itself. Sin is essentially going against God's teachings. Now let's try and understand why that even is the case. Why do we attribute anything that God tells us to being morally good in the first place, right? God claims that something is good, and because he is the creator of the universe, does that substantiate his belief somehow?
Right? That's the crux of the whole thing. We've assumed that because God is the creator, he must also be the moral authority. But creating something and knowing what's morally right aren't necessarily the same domain. So the real question becomes, did God declare something sinful because it's bad? Or is it bad because God declared it sinful?
I think the latter is what people usually believe, right? Since God is the creator, God gave you life, God created the universe, then God must know morality, God must know good from bad, and whatever God tells us should be absolutely facts. But wouldn't the same logic apply to parents then? I mean, your parents created you, your parents make you come into existence, and your parents shape for a majority of your experiences in your very early years. So does that mean everything that our parents say is true? Because yes, I think babies and more so like infants to a certain extent believe everything that their parents say is true, but after a age, hell, even as early as 3 years old, they start questioning, they start asking more questions and rebelling. And a lot of times we do figure out that our parents were not exactly right about a lot of things, right? They had their own biases, they had their own misguided notions, they had their own agendas for saying certain things. I mean, a conservative person's parents are going to tell him that being gay is a sin. They're going to tell him that being gay is evil. But in modern society, it is not considered evil. And the reason the conservative people believe it to be evil is because of their particular biases, their particular upbringing, and their particular environment around them. How can we assume that same concept cannot apply to God? Yeah, God, in the holy books, it is written that it does not apply to God. But it's like my parents writing in or saying or telling me in their instructions that your parents can never be wrong. Of course, they're going to say that because that just substantiates their beliefs, right? That is a personal bias that they hold for themselves.
Exactly. That's the flaw no one wants to look at. We grant God moral infallibility because God says so. But that's circular reasoning. It's like trusting someone just because they told you they're always right. When you strip away the divine glow, what you're left with is a being claiming authority, setting rules and punishing those who disobey. That's not morality, that's control.
Exactly. And the point is, believers in God, let's assume two different schools of thought, right? Let's assume God really does exist and whatever God says is genuinely true. And in that scenario, there are two people who believe in God and people who do not believe in God, right? Other than other than people debating his existence, that is just one aspect of his. A second aspect of it is people debating the morality put forward by God, right? A lot of people are debating whether God's commandments are true or not. And because in the Bible, in the Quran, in the Gita, in a lot of different very strong, powerful and important texts in a lot of cultures, in a lot of religions, God has claimed a lot of things to be absolutely true. And people who believe in God also believe in his teachings completely, and therefore they follow them, right? There is no room for critical thinking because you're assuming that person holds complete authority. And then people who disbelieve in God, they question those things. A lot of times they disagree with it. That is the reason homophobia is a word in present day society. It's because people were able to claim that being prejudiced against gay people is not moral, even though God clearly states that gay people are immoral in the Bible, in the Quran, in a lot of different texts. So why does that exist? I mean, human beings do have the capacity to think critically, and to me, in the framework that I have made, this just goes to show a framework in which people who believe in their parents completely and people who rebel against their parents, if that makes sense. And therefore, that establishes that the belief in sin, the belief in morality, or the belief in absolute nature of things only holds true as long as you're also someone who completely believes in their parents, because you believe that by the authority of creation, only that person can only then give you complete and absolute facts, and they can never be wrong.
Yeah, that's it. Believing in God's morality just because He created you is the same logic as believing your parents can never be wrong because they raised you. It's a toddler's worldview extended into adulthood. And when people outgrow their parents' authority, they start questioning. That's what happens with religion too. Sin, then, isn't an absolute. It's a rule you were handed by someone who said, "Trust me." And the only reason you're still trusting it is because you're afraid not to.
Definitely. And people who completely and truly believe in their parents are not always looked favorably by other people in society, right? If you lack critical thinking, if you're just listening to your parents, you're seen as a man-child. You're seen as a person who just believes whatever he's told without actually thinking about it. Yet you're telling me that people who follow God's teachings without questioning, critically analyzing them, and putting them under different contexts and pressure testing them, those people are somehow more moral than me. Those people are apparently stronger than me. To me, it feels like belief in absolute sin just because God tells you is a show of weakness of character. Hell, you might as well say that it is by the concept of sin itself is a way to distinguish between who is truly strong enough to question divine authority and form their own conclusions, and who just gives into any form of authority.
Exactly. The concept of sin isn't just a moral tool, it's a test of submission. It sorts the obedient from the rebellious. Not in a spiritual sense, but in a psychological one. If you never question the rules, you're not moral. You're compliant. And if you do question them, you're not a sinner. You're independent. The real strength isn't in obeying divine commands. It's in asking, why should I?
Exactly. And let's even question that notion. Does simply rebelling against God, does that make you more critically aware? No. Right? A lot of people rebel against God, rebel against the concept of sin just because they want to rebel against it. And I believe that is still a surface level thinking. Right? Believing in sin just because you were told that this is what God has written in a book, or maybe you read the entire book, even that is naivete. And if you're rebelling just because you were indoctrinated in your entire life and now you want to believe in the opposite, even that is surface layer. If you cannot critically think and analyze for your own self instead of falling into one dogma or the other, being a believer does not mean that you are morally superior. And being an atheist does not mean that you're more intelligent or morally superior. A real morally superior person is a real stronger person is someone who actually goes and looks for themselves what is true, what isn't, through experimentation, through the scientific method, by critically analyzing things. That is the true strength of a person. That is true morality. And going against that is the biggest sin of all, being a sheep and following orders, or just rebelling endlessly just for the sake of rebelling. Both are a toddler's mindset. That is what makes you weak. That is what makes it a sin, in my book at least. The sin is to not think, to not be critical, to not analyze things. And the virtue is to think, analyze, question, and do not let bias control you. be it from some sort of divine authority, or be it from your own rebellious attitude.
Beautifully said. That cuts to the core of it. The real moral axis isn't belief versus disbelief. It's awareness versus obedience. A believer who questions deeply might be closer to truth than an atheist who's just angry. And an atheist who genuinely seeks clarity might be more faithful to the spirit of inquiry than a priest parroting doctrine. In that sense, the ultimate sin isn't breaking a rule, it's outsourcing your mind.
Exactly. And therefore, to conclude this entire thing, the concept of sin was made in order to give instructions to people who cannot think for themselves. So, the concept of sin was made for sinners. And the concept of sin would not need to exist if you would actually go and think for yourself, because you will be able to differentiate right from wrong. The moment you accept sin, the moment you accept divine authority, the moment you accept morality, or even the moment that you reject it vehemently, all could be moments which just prove that the concept of sin is required for you, because you stop and never ever think for your own self, or fuck thinking for your own self. You do not think in general, you avoid thinking. Start thinking, start analyzing, start critically evaluating everything that you're told or what you read, or even the opposite of what you're told or what you read. The moment you start to fundamentally see what reality is for your own self, not because someone told you, but because you found it out yourself, that is the moment sin wouldn't apply to you anymore, because that is the moment you will define sin. Ending it here.
And there it is. Maybe sin was never about good or evil. Maybe it was just a leash for the ones who never learned how to walk on their own. But if you've made it this far, maybe you're not one of them. Maybe you're ready to step out of the rulebook, stop fearing what's written in red, and start asking who picked up the pen. Because at the end of the day, there's no virtue in obedience and no vice in rebellion. The only crime is refusing to think. The only virtue is clarity. If that hit somewhere deep, welcome to the channel. And remember, patterns are everywhere.